Hey there, geometry peeps. Today we are talking about kites. Alright, so now we're talking about the properties of kites. So, what's the definition of a kite? A kite is a quadrilateral with two distinct pairs of consecutive, congruent sides. Consecutive, congruent sides. Alright, so pretty much what you have is something like this. And this piece is congruent to this piece, and this piece is congruent to this piece. So different from what we're used to. Not opposite sides, but consecutive sides are now congruent. Okay, so on top of that, it has some other properties as well. So we know consecutive sides are congruent. So this piece and this piece. And then three other special properties. So let's fill those in. The first one is exactly one pair of opposite angles are congruent. Now, it's always the angles on the shorter diagonal. Now, I'm going to draw in two diagonals here so we have a sense of what we're working with, because those become very important moving forward. Okay, so the congruent angles, and I'm going to write this in a different color so it pops out, are always on the shorter diagonal. Shorter diagonal. So that means this entire angle and this entire angle, because here's your short diagonal, here's your long diagonal. Okay? Now, the next special property is one diagonal is a perpendicular bisector of the other. So one diagonal is a perpendicular bisector of the other. Now, looking at this picture, it's exactly what you think. The longer one bisects the shorter one. So it's perpendicular, so we know all four are 90, and this long diagonal here cuts the shorter one in half. So longer bisects shorter. So longer diagonal bisects the shorter one. Alright, so the longer diagonal bisects the shorter one. And then there's one more special property, and it's the longer diagonals. The longer diagonal is an angle bisector. Okay. The longer diagonal is an angle bisector. So it cuts those opposite angles in half. So it cuts these little pieces here are congruent. Alright, so you got to be careful because it's a little tricky, because the shorter diagonal, the whole things are congruent. It's not a bisector. And the longer diagonal, they're both bisectors, however both angles are not congruent. Alright, so let's examine that in the next example here. So it says kite SCAR is a kite. SRA, so SRA, the whole thing is 46, and CSA is 35. So that's what we're starting with. Now it says find all the missing angles. Say what? How am I going to find all those angles just based off of that little piece of information? Well, it's exactly what we need. The first thing I would always do is we know they're perpendicular bisectors of each other. So you know they're perpendicular, so they make 90s. Alright, the second piece is, you know, this is an angle bisector, the longer diagonal. So it's going to cut 46 into 23 and 23 degrees. So we know those two pieces, and from here we can run with it. Now if you look here, you have a triangle. Alright, if this is 23 and this is 90, we know this triangle equals 180. So 180 minus 90 minus 23 gives me 67. Alright, now let's move up here, so we know this is 35 and 90. So 180 minus 90 minus 35 gives me 55 degrees. And we know this is an angle bisector, so this is 55. Now this side just mimics the other side, because if we do that addition, we get 35 again, and if we do the same thing down here, we get 67 again. So again, I want to point out the tricky parts. These two little pieces are equal. We know that. However, these two little pieces are equal, but the big pieces aren't the same. over here, the big pieces are the same, but the little pieces aren't necessarily equal. So just some things to know about a kite, and it's not so bad once you get used to it. Okay, so that's dealing with the angles. Now let's talk about the sides. Now this is going to be fun. So we have GLOV is a kite. Find GOLV and the perimeter of GLOV. Okay, so we got a lot. Let's start with, let's just go in order. Let's start with GO. So we want to find from G to O. Well, we know this is 5, okay, and we know this is 12. That's it. So let's just fill in what we think we know. Well, we know consecutive sides are congruent, so that's got to be 20. Okay, we don't know these two sides, so that can be a little tricky, but we know this is 90. Now, I'm going to take you back to first semester here. Given two sides, how do we find the third? Given two sides, how do we find the third? So we have this picture here, 12 and 20, and we need to find EO, which we're going to call X. Well, given two sides of a right triangle, the way we find the third is Pythagorean theorem. So we have A squared plus B squared equals C squared. All right, so we go from here. 144 equals 400. We're solving for X, so we subtract 144, and I get 256. Square root both sides, and X is 16. So I know this piece is 16, so I can now find GO, because GO is made up of 5 and 16, which gives me 21. So that came from 5 plus 16. Alright, not so bad. Now let's find LV. So LV here, we want this piece. Well, we know the bigger diagonal bisects the shorter diagonal. So we know these two pieces are congruent. So if that's 12, we know this is 12. So that means LV is 12 plus 12, which is 24. Alright, so we got those two pieces down. Now we got to find the perimeter. Well, we know these two pieces. We know 20 and 20, but we don't know this one. But what do we got? We got another right triangle. So we got this piece here, with this being 5 and 12, and we need to find the hypotenuse. So 5 squared plus 12 squared equals X squared. So 25 plus 144. So I get 169 equals X squared. When we square root, we get X to be 13. So we know this is 13, and we know consecutive sides are congruent. So that's 13. So the perimeter itself is 13 plus 13 plus 20 plus 20, right, which gives me a perimeter of 66 units. Alright, so there's my perimeter. Here's my LV. Here's my GO. And that's all I got. Check you laters.